Right, ladies and gentlemen, hello and welcome. My name is Guy Anderson and I'm a Senior Principal Analyst at IHS AD&S. It's my great pleasure to welcome you to this online intelligence briefing focusing on Russian sanctions after 1 year.
The Ukraine crisis all kicked off when protests erupted over Viktor Yanukovych's plans to cancel a free trade association with the EU. When those turned violent at the start of 2014, Yanukovych ended up fleeing Kiev on the 21st of February. Within a week, we started seeing Russian troops move out of their bases in Crimea and begin to cut off the peninsula. This kind of sparked a month-long process of consolidation, and during this period we saw the sanctions first put in place against Russian officials by US and EU officials. So just to demonstrate the fact that all is still not well in East Ukraine, this is a graph showing the number of incidents that the Ukrainian National Security and Defense Council has reported during the month of July. So each incident would be a time a Ukrainian government position has been shelled or come under small arms fire. In fact, on average, it's between 50 and 80 recorded incidents a day, with casualties recorded on most days, if not fatal casualties. And this kind of serves to demonstrate the ongoing nature of the conflict, even in a low-level way, and why the sanctions against Russia are continuing.
Sanctions by Western countries started in March 2014, with the EU targeting 21 individuals. Over the first half of that year, sanctions increased, covering additional individuals and arms exports until 31 July, when the EU launched a full-blown arms embargo and announced targeted sanctions and a decision through the Common European Foreign and Security Policy concerning the situation in Ukraine. The 31 July EU sanctions brought into place an embargo on sales to Russia of military equipment where the Russian military was the listed end user, as well as procurement from the Russian defense industry. The EU sanctions also ban the sale and export of dual-use items for military use or military end users in Russia. Key point to this is that non-military space industry was excluded from the sanctions. Where we've seen the most damage has been in financial institutions, with the prohibitions against the state-owned banks, as we see there, including Sberbank, VTB Bank, and Venezia-Bank. In 2015, the sanctions have been extended, with the Crimea-related bans, sanctions, and freezes extended through to June 2016. Currently, the targeted individuals list stands at 151, partly as the EU continues to identify those involved in the fighting in Ukraine. But other additions have included some senior Russian military strategists and leaders who are perceived to be involved in directing the campaign, providing logistical support, and so on. And now, just look at the US. Much like the EU sanctions, there was a gradual increase in pressure following the Russian annexation of the Crimea, with US President Barack Obama signing into effect 3 executive orders authorizing the targeting of individuals and companies associated with the Russian annexation. And this then evolved into a wider interpretation to include actors involved in the ongoing conflict in eastern Ukraine and the Russian industrial complex. In late July 2014, this was expanded alongside the EU sanctions to target energy companies, banks, and defense companies. In addition to this, the US government also suspended credit for US businesses that exported to Russia, development aid, and sale of oil and gas technologies for use in the offshore and Arctic oil industries as well. Jumping forward to 2015, the U.S. Department of Treasury's Office of Foreign Asset Control, OFAC, currently lists 110 entities and 99 individuals, depending on the risk score. Recent additions including Russian motorcycle groups and militant groups operating in Ukraine, as well as an oil and gas field in the Sea of Okhotsk, which is between Sakhalin and the Kamchatka Peninsula on Russia's east coast.
It's important to understand that sanctions are just one of the factors that are part of a perfect storm that have hit the Russian economy this year. The Russian economy was already very vulnerable to an external shock when Western sanctions were invoked. In fact, the economy was heading into recession as early as the third quarter of 2014, even before the harshest of the Western sanctions were incurred. Sanctions on investment in technologically advanced oil and gas development in Russia and on the transfer of technology will also have an impact on potential Russian oil production. Another part of the problem for the Russian economy, and this is due mostly to sanctions on access to capital markets in the European Union and U.S., is a cut in credit creation. In real ruble terms, bank lending has barely grown at all year on year, and in U.S. dollar terms, it has contracted sharply. Heavy debt loads, the lack of access to external finance due to the sanctions are handicapping banks. And the banks are in turn facing a rising share of non-performing loans due to the ongoing recession. If oil prices will fall further, and recently we've seen a new drop in oil prices, the Russian recession will be deeper and longer than we currently forecast. And there will be more severe impacts for the ruble, for inflation, for household real income, for investment intentions, and for receipts by the state. Perhaps most importantly, the impact of the sanctions regime will outlive the sanctions themselves.
There are numerous indications that Russia is interested to settle for some political resolution over Ukraine with the West. Russia's aims in Ukraine can be summarized as not so much focused on gaining new territory, but keeping Ukraine unstable and disunited, and the Ukrainian government primarily focused on the war in the East rather than on economic reform, improving governance, and fighting corruption. Our baseline scenario is that Putin remains in office until 2018 and will likely seek re-election in March 2018 elections. If he does, he's almost certain to win, as his control over all elements of the government remains high. However, the political system in Russia remains unbalanced, as evidenced by the ascendance of the Siloviki, the former KGB and security services officers, in the past 12 months. The liberals remain sidelined and unlikely to come back to key positions in the government to undertake the needed structural reforms.
So in nominal terms, the defense budget went from $10 billion in 2005 to $53 billion this year. So that was an increase. That's essentially a rate of increase of about 8% a year on average in nominal terms. In real terms, that means that the budget's more than doubled in a decade, and it's gone from 2.5% of GDP to 4.2% this year. And that's really kind of a truly exceptional level of growth. We don't really see that elsewhere. And despite the deterioration of the economy, 2015 is actually going to be the biggest annual increase yet. That's around a 26% increase in the defence budget this year. But the other important thing here is that we're now coming to the end of this period, and that's really a direct result of the deteriorating economic and fiscal climate that we've heard about. At the moment, projections for 2016 and 2017 are flat. As you can see there, the two shaded bars at the end of the chart. But in all likelihood, we'll actually see cuts implemented by the time the next budget's approved. So in terms of recent trends, we've seen this extraordinary increase in defence budget over the last decade or so, and perhaps more importantly, it's the fact that this has been sustained for a decade, which you get the odd country where we get these large increases maybe for a couple of years in a row, but this is a decade of rapid growth. And the reason it's been sustained is that the modernisation of Russia's armed forces has really been made a priority by the Kremlin. And even when the budget has come under pressure, which it has over recent years, Putin's personally stepped in to kind of smooth the way for further increases in the military budget. And usually that's been against the guidance of the finance ministry.